So I'll be presenting in English, and I'll be focusing very much on what this COVID-19 means for international trade. And so what evidence do we have so far as to how it's impacting on trade? Obviously, you're aware of some of the effects already, even in Ecuador. And then in the second part of the presentation, I'll try and focus on, so I'll be looking at what are the supply chain risks and how can we try and take those into account for our businesses, and how we can try and quantify some of these risks. And then I will look specifically at some of the products that Ecuador is exporting and give some examples as the kind of strategies that we could look at in a situation like this. So just to say that Eduardo already mentioned very much the impact, the economic impact that has been felt by COVID-19, and he gave the figure of $50 billion of global exports that were wiped off what was the baseline expected trade that would happen in February. And just generally, the World Trade Organization last week came out with some new predictions as well as to how much global trade is likely to fall, and it's expected to fall between 13 and 32% in 2020. The reason for such large variations is that it's very difficult to know the exact scenario of what's going to happen and the speed of the spread as well across economies. So the margin of error in these estimations is quite large. What's interesting is the bottom left-hand diagram, which has the manufacturing and services exports, and we can see a very rapid drop in those particular exports and services in particular. And so the kind of services that we're accustomed to hearing about is airline services and travel and restaurants and others, but then there are other types of services. Even many of the professional services are getting impacted now by the COVID-19, even if some of the work can be done remotely. But trading goods, of course, and manufactured goods in particular, has also taken a massive shock as well. If we also look at the trend since 2000 of trade, there were two different trend lines. There was an earlier trend line, which was from 1990 to 2008, and we could see it was an upward sloping, not quite exponential growth that was taking place in trade. And since 2011 to 2018, particularly with the advent of trade wars and more protectionist measures by some of the more advanced economies, we've actually seen that trend line decline. But now with COVID-19, the more optimistic and pessimistic scenarios are below that trend line as well. So we see a rapid decline in international trade happening as a result of COVID-19, and this is already in a very bad situation, because 2019, as you recall, we had the Brexit uncertainties, which affected very much the European Union and the United Kingdom, and then we had the trade wars, which were affecting the United States and China, and so that bad year that already occurred is obviously compounding to the problems that we're now facing this year as well with the COVID-19. Just to say that governments are reacting in different ways to the COVID-19, and so ITC, as well as the University of St. Gallen, are collecting different levels of trade measures that are introduced by different economies to try and either restrict trade or to try and liberalize trade as a result of COVID-19. And so most of these restrictions or liberalization concern pharmaceutical products, so things like gloves and masks and protective gowns, but it also covers things like food security. And so many countries are also trying to limit the export of certain goods, but also you have some countries that are now imposing extra restrictions for the import of goods because of the concerns that it could be contaminated. And so these measures are increasing quite rapidly, particularly the restrictive measures. Obviously, the liberalizing measures from a trade perspective are positive. But this compounding trade effects is obviously going to also make it much more difficult to be able to trade. I just wanted to share here, it's a very old survey that was conducted in 2011, but the reason I'm presenting it is that it was asking supply chain managers what they perceive to be the greatest risks to supply chains in general. And if you look at the pandemics, it was considered that pandemics wouldn't be showing a very high impact for their supply chain management. Whereas, for example, natural disasters came up on top as being one of the most critical problems that could face supply chain managers. In the case of COVID, so COVID-19 is the first pandemic of its kind in the 21st century, since we've never had something that's actually had a global shutdown on this scale before. We've had obviously SARS and MERS and Ebola and other types of we had Zika and other types of pandemics, but we had nothing of this particular scale. And obviously the spread of this and the speed of spread of this virus is also quite alarming. And so there are many different types of knock-on effects that are triggered by COVID-19. Some of them are policy orientated, so they're man-made, such as import and export restrictions. But there's also the demand shocks which arise from COVID-19. So it's not just supply shocks, even though supply shocks were the first way of feeling the impact of COVID-19 in the West was the shutdown of factories in China. But now it's more of a demand shock that's emerging. We're also facing long border delays, which also slows down trade. And then there's the problem of shortage of labor, in particular is because of remote working. How do you access, how does the workforce access particularly manufacturing and agricultural operations? And so it's a very unusual situation that's impacting international trade. Here is a comparison made between more traditional disruptions that affect supply chains and how COVID-19 is affecting supply chains. And so on the geography, we see that usually we saw more localized and regional impacts, and more at a regional level, whereas in this case, it's at a global level. Usually we only see it affecting certain industries, those that are in the immediate vicinity of the epicenter of, say, a natural disaster. Whereas in COVID-19, it's affecting generally across the board most goods and services. Usually we see the effect much more on the supply side. So when we had floods in Thailand, for example, a few years ago, some factories were impacted by that. But it was on the supply side constraints, but manufacturers were able to switch their supply to China, and they could overcome those supply chain disruptions. And so again, it's very hard to plan in advance for a situation like COVID-19 since it never occurred before, and therefore it's very difficult to plan for the risks that exist in that. There's, again, for COVID-19, we have a much higher correlation with the financial systems. So there have been some comparisons drawn between the international financial crisis of 2008 and COVID-19, and certainly there are going to be some similarities of what's going to happen. But generally, we wouldn't expect to see such an interlinked effect between what's going on in COVID-19 and the global financial markets as well. COVID-19 is likely to be longer term. Obviously depends on whether a vaccine comes along or not, but if it doesn't, we can also expect increased checks, increased quarantine measures, and increased border delays as a result of it. So a lot of the progress that was made after the Trade Facilitation Agreement was adopted at the WTO. We can see a lot of these, that progress will perhaps be reversed as a result of COVID-19. And then there is the human behavior, and it's very hard to know how consumption is going to change, whether people will continue a hoarding behavior, for example, whether they'll be more prone to saving as opposed to consuming over the longer term, for the fear that something like this could happen again. And so it's very difficult yet to know how habits and behaviors will change as a result of this virus. So it's very different from typical supply chain risks. Just here is to show a little bit how, in particular, some of the modeling work that Eduardo presented, some of the results of what were the expected impacts of COVID-19, how this modeling works, it's actually done. If we start at the bottom right-hand side of this slide, we see the infection rates are increasing, and that has a direct impact on, first of all, closing your borders. That was the first step that most countries took. A second step was then to have lockdown and introduce social distancing in economies. That led to uncertainty. but also the social distancing has led to a lot of unemployment. That's led to workforce disruptions. The workforce disruptions are obviously impacting on output in manufacturing. The increase in unemployment is leading to reduced disposable incomes for consumption. That's affecting retail sales, and so on and so forth. So we see a lot of knock-on effects that is happening and ripple effects that are happening out throughout the economy, which is, of course, again, disrupting all the different steps of that particular supply chain. And so border closures are impacting primarily more the raw materials and supplies, which can be used then by manufacturers in domestic economies. And then more within the borders, we face some of the challenges going from manufacturing to consumption. And so one of the things that we've seen emerging very recently is much more usage of e-commerce, which was obviously a very positive way of trying to overcome the challenges, particularly of retail. But again, in e-commerce, we see a lot of problems with regard to distribution, with regard to stocks and stock management, and the availability of supplies. Also, many e-commerce platforms don't have secure payment systems, so we are going to face also more problems with regard potentially to hacking and other types of crime. So it's a difficult time for governments, in particular regulators, that need to be much more active than they are currently in trying to police and manage this change in the economy that's taking place. Here's just a quote that I thought was quite interesting, because he's focusing on logistics being one of the biggest battles that needs to be won in a war, and in particular in this situation, we see logistics as being particularly problematic in the advent of COVID-19. Here is some work that was done by Richard Baldwin, who's a professor at University of Geneva and is quite a leading expert in this area. Who talks about a triple ripple effect happening to the manufacturing sector. The first one is the direct supply disruptions which emerge when COVID-19 happens. So the supplying countries of parts and components cannot get those components to other countries because their operations have closed down. Then there's the contagion that this creates to other manufacturing processes, and so these are sort of second-tier suppliers to the supply chain that can no longer also meet the requirements, be able to feed the manufacturing process. And then the final step, which is not supply-led but demand-led, is these demand disruptions, which are affected by macroeconomic aggregates, which obviously are going to fall. We see a big reduction in investments, a big reduction in consumer confidence, and then we see a lot of delays with regard to consumers for purchases. So while we're seeing a lot of frenzied spending in basic necessities, we see a reduced spending when it comes to other types of products. And so that's obviously affecting the manufacturing process. And so this is just a standard process map of a global value chain that takes place, and we can see how COVID-19 might affect each one of those particular metrics that we would normally look at in the supply chain. And so usually, for example, you would have a zone of buffer from sourcing your materials to the manufacturing operations. So this would be your inventory that you would be stockpiling. But obviously the inventory again here is unexpected. The disruptions are much longer than would have been expected, and the ability to source from different channels has also been cut. And so again, we see that particular metric would be impacted by COVID-19. And so there's many different points in this supply chain that will be affected differently. From the production cycle, we know that productivity is falling as a result of having less workers. Maybe so many workers are sick. And so manufacturing processes are also slowing down. So that production cycle is also going to reduce. We'll see the asset utilization rates falling, and so on and so forth. And so it depends again. There's a balance between the level of automation in a factory and the impact that would reduce perhaps from COVID-19, and the level of manual labor that you have in your in your factory. And then, of course, when it comes to delivery, the entire transport lead time is also impacted as well. So just to say, COVID-19 doesn't change the model. We still need to look at all these particular factors and how how we set up our processes for manufacturing and our lead times and our risk assessments. But obviously, everything has been elongated and amplified as a result of COVID-19. So McKinsey has done some work as well. They've come out with quite a lot of research in this area, looking at how can we try and also prepare ourselves better for disruptions in our supply chain. And so they talk about different levels of suppliers, tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers, and trying to understand and doing some audit of the capacity of those suppliers, what is their ability to meet their working capital, whether we can extend any credit to them to ensure that they don't go down, and then what extra delays are they facing. And so again, there's a lot of different scenarios that we can use to try and come up with what will be some of the critical hazard points that we will face across our supply chain. Again, here on the customer side, we also need to be aware of our customers. We shouldn't forget about the need to answer to our customers and be responsive to their needs or their complaints. In a period like this, it's very difficult, for example, in e-commerce, to be able to have a refund policy. How do you get your goods shipped back to you if there's any complaints on those goods? And so we need to think of the return policy and how we can deal with that return policy in a period like this. Here again, more overall, the entire chain, we want to think about our inventory levels, including what could be our spare parts for maintenance and any downtime. What could be after-sales stocks, which could be used to keep the production running. Estimating the logistic capacity and the different routes for logistics. This is particularly problematic now because airlines cargo sent by air freight has fallen so dramatically that a lot of produce, that's fresh produce, is going to be affected by this. And so, what are the options? What are the increases in costs as a result of that? And how do you pass on that cost to either your customer, or do you reduce that from your margin? One of the big problems at the moment is credit recovery. So when people owe you money, how do you get that money back, particularly with this chain event of knock-on effects? And so again, this is something that we need to try and prepare for in this period. And so we can do stress tests and looking at sort of what is the value of your portfolio that's at risk from different clients, and try and prepare for that eventuality. And so here is from Price Waterhouse, a vendor supply chain risk. So just to zoom in on that particular issue and trying to analyze what are all the different providers that you have in your supply chain, your suppliers, contractors, and immediate suppliers. So subcontractors, sorry, and immediate suppliers. And trying to give a risk score to each of these different suppliers. Prepare yourself for introducing a particular risk management strategy to combat that particular risk. So there's the vendor identification, verifying and screening the vendor, try and improve your due diligence across the supply network, then give a credit score, a risk score to the vendor, and then introduce whatever risk management strategy that you need to try and deal with that particular vendor. The most extreme one might be to switch to another vendor. The other one might be to try and extend credit or to improve your monitoring of their particular processes to ensure that you're alerted well in time of any problems that they face, et cetera, et cetera. Generally, punitive strategies in this particular period wouldn't be the most encouraged policy to be adopted right now. Just to say on the demand side, so again, Eduardo showed a lot of the statistics on the demand side. And just to say the OECD stats, I think, are slightly overestimated. I think now, with what's going on, I think we would see a downgrade in a lot of those predictions. Because if you look at the OECD on the bottom right-hand side, predictions for different economies, we see that a lot of the major economies of the world, these are a lot of the clients of Ecuador, the GDPs are expected to fall quite dramatically in many of these economies. This is not yearly drops, these are quarterly drops, but nevertheless it will take some time before these countries can pick themselves up again. On the food side, and of course Ecuador is a major exporter of commodities and food commodities, we see a huge drop in foods in general. So that 2020 line in red in the bottom left-hand side for the FAO overall food price index, you can see a huge drop that's occurring in 2020. The year before it was increasing quite dramatically, so we're back to a low sort of midpoint of 2019 levels at this stage. And on the top right-hand side, Eduardo had mentioned some of them, but we see these graphs showing their downward slopes since mid-January to end of March. We see a lot of these food prices have dropped quite substantially. So the impact on demand is quite significant, and there's a number of other effects that are impacting on trade apart from demand. So there's these disruption of intermediate goods, which we mentioned earlier. There's the slower border controls, and just to illustrate that, there's the bottom right-hand chart is showing you the average time it takes to clear goods across European borders. And as you know, European borders tend to be relatively frictionless. Here we see that average increase has more than doubled. The average time, to clear goods has more than doubled since in just a month. And so when it comes to other countries, these figures might look much worse. We could also expect the emergence of new SPS standards to be adopted by many countries. That hasn't yet happened. It's not that so there are more checks taking place at the border. There's more risk management usage being done at the border, but we could expect new SPS standards to emerge, particularly from developed countries. There's this issue of diversion of interest. So it's diverting interest away from traditional trade and more to obviously national problems. And in particular, there's this interest to become more secure, to be self-reliant within your own economy. E-commerce is growing quite quickly. It's actually the only way to engage in trade at this stage. And so that's a more positive outlet and channel for trade to be re-engaged. The effect of artificial intelligence and automation is also going to have an impact, obviously, on jobs negatively, but it would also help us perhaps overcome some of the problems we're facing right now with the coronavirus. And then I think generally this is something we've been seeing anyway for the last decade, is this drive away from global value chains and more towards regional or national value chains as a result of this epidemic. And I think even if things do get better in the next 6 months, I think we will still see people trying to work towards building more localized global value chains, which of course affects quite strongly many of the developing countries that need the more advanced markets to be able to export to. Just to say, in terms of sectors that are going to be most impacted by the virus, I shouldn't have said exposed, since actually all sectors are exposed. But we see the ones at the top are the ones that are most impacted. And so these are in the news a lot. So this is travel, retail, transport, apparel, and automotive manufacturers, mainly on the supply side for the automotive side. But also, if we see less mobility, we can expect a change in consumer demand for cars. There's more moderate exposure on the left-hand side, and then we have a much lower exposure on the right-hand side, and these are more industries that are either state-owned industries, or they're more national-based and less tradable in general. And so we see those particular industries being less exposed and less impacted by the virus. Just to say that obviously Ecuador is impacted by the appreciation of the dollar. As usual, when there's concern about the global economy, people tend to take refuge in the US dollar, and so that appreciates the dollar. And especially vis-a-vis your neighbors, who are your direct competitors in those third markets, they have devalued, they've depreciated their currencies, while you have an appreciated currency. And so that makes it much more difficult for you to be able to compete with those economies. And we see emerging markets, which is the purple line, the advanced emerging markets have particularly depreciated their currency against the US dollar. And that would include Brazil. We've also see quite a flood of financial of capital leaving the emerging markets, and that's both related to the diaspora making remittances, but also obviously foreign direct investment is halted at this stage until we know what's going to happen. And then we've also seen capital markets withdraw funds to safer havens. And so we're seeing quite a dramatic impact on emerging markets. And of course, FDI and trade are also quite intensively linked. Here is just an indication of all the different risks that businesses tend to have to look at when considering national and global impacts. And so this is not linked specifically to COVID-19. And so, but all of these different things are now impacted by COVID-19 to a certain extent. So some are less impacted than others. We are hearing that there is quite a lot of cybersecurity risks taking place now. For example, we heard recently that Zoom, which is what this presentation is taking place on, has been prone to attacks, and there are risks with regards to conducting business over a network like Zoom. And we can also expect to be more hacking as well of Teams and other types of online services as well, even though we haven't heard so many cases yet here. But we'll also see other types of, the external policy environment, the ability to trade, let's say the credit risks of our customers, the ability to supply, etc. So all these different risks are now have to be reevaluated by the company. And so one of the ways we obviously do that, for those who are familiar with risk management, is to use something a bit like a risk management matrix. It doesn't have to look like this, but we try and gauge, first of all, what is the likelihood of that risk? And so that's a difficult thing, obviously, to predict, particularly with regards to something, again, that's so unknown like COVID-19. Nevertheless, we are seeing quite a lot of modeling taking place. There's quite a lot of literature around COVID-19 that can be applied to try and understand what is the probability of something happening. So we look at the occurrence, the probability of occurrence, and then we see what is the consequence if that occurrence takes place. And so we see in the bottom left-hand quadrant, we see basically a risk level that we can tolerate, because we think that the likelihood is quite small, but also the consequences or the impact of it is quite small. And then we have more higher level of likelihood and consequence. And then we have in the red things which we cannot tolerate, and that could affect our business quite dramatically. And so these are an example of how we could try and evaluate these different risks. And so one of the things that we can look at is some of these risk forecasts. Obviously, we haven't been very good, economists in general, I count myself as an economist as well, aren't usually very good at forecasting what is the future, but we try and have a good guess at it. And here is some work that's also done are looking at just general environmental risks or financial risks or political risks, societal risks of uprising and other types of risks that can occur. And this is at the global level, and so you would need to do this obviously for Ecuador. But what's interesting here, this is the 2020 map that came out on the 17th of January. And we see that infectious diseases in general are seen as having quite a big impact. So they had quite a good forecast that should an infectious disease break out, it would have a very large impact. But that the likelihood of this is relatively low, right? It's actually one of the lowest. You've got weapons of mass destruction, you've got unmanageable inflation that's got a lower likelihood, and then we have infectious diseases. Obviously, that's probably wasn't inaccurate at the time, but obviously now it's happened, and so it's obviously very, very prominent now. And I think the impact would also be considered to be much higher, and higher than, for example, a natural disaster, because the global impact is so significant. So we need to again revisit a lot of these different risk maps. Right, I will go quickly on this because I realize I've been talking too long. Just to say, so we try to analyze some specific products for Ecuador in a slightly different way to try and see what could be a response to the COVID-19. So first of all, we try to look at, well, how is transportation being disrupted, particularly maritime transportation being disrupted by COVID-19. As I said before, airlift is a problem. Airlines have cut a lot of the flights. Other couriers tend to have their own airlines, and they are still operating, but they're also operating at a higher cost. So here we have the different markets that Ecuador exports to, and we have the percentage of exports going to those markets in the second column. And then we've tried to categorize those risks according to what is the port capacity, what are the actual operations of the port, and how are they working? Are they working normally or not? Are they facing too much congestion, for example? Is it difficult to find storage? Is it difficult to get your goods fumigated, etc.? And then how are shipping rates being impacted at the moment? And so what's interesting with this map, and this is something that this table needs to be updated constantly, obviously, when you're doing your risk management, is to see the red, of course. This is where you've got your alarm bells in that risk matrix. These are not very tolerable levels, perhaps. And a lot of the problems are faced in the EU and the US. While 2 or 3 months ago, this picture would have been quite reversed. We would have seen the red in East Asia, and we would have seen it more green across the EU and the US. And so this is, I think, something that we need to have as a dashboard to try and monitor, what are the impacts on global trade. And so we're working actually with clients to actually try and do this monitoring process and prepare them for switching potentially markets quite rapidly. And so on the theme of switching, we try to analyze what particular markets could you switch to because of the problems of COVID and potential border closures taking place in those markets. And so here we start with the competitive analysis. So this is pretty standard strategy preparation. We're looking at Ecuador's exports of bananas, for example. Where does it go to? And who are the other suppliers of bananas to those particular markets? And so if we just take the example of Germany, for example, Ecuador exports quite a large amount to Germany. It's quite a major market, second to the United States. But Colombia is a major exporter to that market. And we already just saw that Colombia obviously has a massive price advantage over you. So although you have your contract still running, at some point it's going to be difficult for you to be able to maintain that competition with Colombia. You both face the same problems, though, with regard to transport delays and transport costs to be able to reach Germany. We would want to compare that to potentially another market that would supply bananas to Germany. Here we just looked at the major suppliers to Germany, but there are others, and in particular there's African suppliers, right? And so the African suppliers are a much closer market to the EU. They have, like you, the free trade agreements as well, so they have perfect market access. So we'd also want to be tracking how Africa is also being able to respond to these specific markets. And then we see markets that are untapped that you could potentially export to. Just to say, we also take a longer view of this. So we look at forecasts of what is going to be the demand in those economies, and particularly their food demand, their net food demand with the rest of the world up to 2025, which also kind of indicates whether we want to invest some effort into tapping into those markets. And so we've looked here, the table kind of summarizes for bananas, and this is slightly at an aggregated level. We'd want to go to a bit more detail than what type of bananas we can export. But we see potential major importers of that product that are untapped. And so we think that there could be potential for Ecuador to try and export to those specific markets that may not be facing the same lockdown problems that some of your traditional markets are. Some of them, and this is based on obviously their net demand into the future, but it's also based on your tariff capacity, it's based on your distances and shipping costs to reach that market, and also looking at the relative importance of those markets in the world economy for bananas. And so we saw, for example, Vietnam is a very interesting market because Vietnam is, although they are facing a lockdown, they're expected to end that lockdown in 2 weeks' time. It has a major demand for bananas, and you have quite good access to that market in terms of shipping costs and tariffs, and you don't currently export to that market. And so there is an example where we would see it would be worthwhile to try and invest in the Vietnamese market. And so we make this analysis for different markets. And so we do something similar for cocoa beans. And again, this presentation will be on the website, so you can have a look at it later. But here we see, for example, Ecuador is in direct competition to Nigeria and Cameroon and Ghana for just Nigeria and Cameroon to supply the Indonesian market, which is an important market for you. And so again, we can do similar analysis to see what are our advantages, what might be some disruptions that we face in comparison to some of the African neighbors, the African countries. And then take some corrective actions, reduce the prices, or decide to switch to other markets. Obviously, easier said than done. I'm making it sound very simple. As you know, being businessmen, it's not as simple as that. But this is a first step to try and prepare for the consequences of this pandemic. And so here we have the main markets where we see the highest potential actually for cocoa beans are the ones you're exporting to. So this is a situation where actually, based on the different criteria we've used, we actually think that these are good markets that you're exporting to. Nevertheless, there is still untapped potential at the bottom of the table that we think you could try and exploit. And then finally, we do another analysis here again with plantain. Obviously, we can do this with all products. It's a little time consuming, so I'm only presenting 3 products in this case. But we do the similar analysis here for other markets as well. Okay, and so we see a lot of products have common markets, and then you're a sole exporter to some other markets as well. We also see some of your products are going through markets to reach other markets as well. And so one of the things will be perhaps you could circumvent and go directly to some of the markets that you're trying to reach, like Saudi Arabia. And again, so here we see a lot of untapped markets: Qatar, Honduras, El Salvador, Senegal, and Poland, where there might be strong potential. So they're worth looking at